Maurice Frenchy Theriault was born in 1936 to farmer parents Philippe and Alice Theriault. They were French Canadians living in Van Buren, Maine, which was a very tiny town on the Canadian border. By all accounts, Philippe was an awful man. They would use the term a very hard man back in those days, but if you'll forgive me for saying, Philippe was that kind of special son of a bitch that definitely needed to be prosecuted for probably all sorts of things that we'll never really know about. But some of them we do. Philippe kind of believed that many hands made light work. Therefore, he and Alice had 15 children that could work their farm. He thought nothing of doling out slaps and punches and kicks when the slightest offense was caused in his mind or the kids made the slightest mistake. Maurice seemed to be his special boy. He was the target of most of Philippe's abuse, and Alice tried to protect him as much as she could, but she was getting it too, you guys. Back in the day, there was no divorce, so you just kind of dealt with it the best way that you could, and that's what she did. At the age of 5, Maurice's life consisted of nothing but abuse and hard labor. He enjoyed school because it was safe there, but Philippe didn't hold stock in education, and Maurice missed so much school weeks and weeks at a time, especially during planting and harvesting seasons, that he was 13 in the 3rd grade. And despite Philippe's treatment of young Maurice, everyone considered him to be a gentle soul, and the only bright spot in Maurice's life was his mother, Alice. She was a very devout woman, and she knew exactly what Maurice was going through at home. And this, I guess you could call a trauma bond or what have you, it drew them quite close. And Maurice loved his mother a lot. One afternoon, Maurice tells of a story that just absolutely changed his entire life. He says that he came home from school to go looking for his father, and he found him in the barn. Things get kind of foggy here because Maurice never really goes into details about what he witnesses, but he says that he caught his father in an act that was so unholy that it shocked and scarred him for life. Maurice says that when he saw what his father was doing, he knew that it wasn't to be witnessed, so he tried to back out slowly and quietly as not to be noticed. And he ended up knocking over a pitchfork in the process, which clattered to the floor and, of course, caused Philippe to turn and find his son standing there. Philippe immediately grabbed Maurice by the neck and made his son participate in his horrible pastime activity, and told him that if he didn't, that he would be killed and thrown in the manure pile out back. Philippe, when it came to these sorts of things, was definitely a man of his word. Maurice was definitely scared of him, and so he says that he didn't really know what he was doing, but he did as he was told. And a lot of people seem to think that what Maurice caught his father doing and ultimately participated in were inappropriate acts with animals. And it wasn't a one-time occurrence. This happened over and over again throughout Maurice's life. It haunted him so much so that he would normally regularly attend church with his mother. He found comfort there, like I said. And now he was so ashamed that he couldn't even stand religious imagery or anything that had to do with it because he felt so ashamed and so unclean. He was no longer worthy of God's love. He had committed this act of evil, and, now God wouldn't want anything to do with him. The next life-changing event occurred when Maurice was 14. He'd always had trouble with his chores on the farm. Maurice was a slight kid, he was kind of scrawny, not a lot of muscle mass, kind of wispy child. They said that he kind of looked sickly a little bit, and his chores were always very hard for him to do. He always struggled with them, but he managed to get them done. And one of the things that was just like the bane of his existence was going out every day and starting this tractor because his legs weren't long enough. One day he went out to do this, and Philippe was in an especially generous mood. Oh, goodness, look at that. And knocked his son from the tractor, causing a gash to open up in the back of his head. It began to bleed freely. He gave him a vicious beating without a word. He climbed on the tractor, Philippe did, and he drove off into the sunset to do whatever it was that he had to do that day. I don't think we want to know what that is. Maurice stood up, his hands clenched and fists at his side, and he actually spoke out against his father, yelling at his back, "I'd rather work for the devil than work for you." The feeling of empowerment he got from this, just voicing it and getting it out loud, made him feel stronger somehow, and so he kept screaming it. The farther that Philippe got away from him, the louder he would scream it, and he would repeat it over and over. "I'd rather work for the devil. I'd rather work for the devil." And, you know, of course, Philippe couldn't hear him. The tractor was too loud, but somebody did that day. Maurice says that the next day he awoke and he felt energized. This horrible gash that was in the back of his head had spontaneously knit itself together and healed. His bruises were gone. He wasn't sore at all. And he said that he went out that day and he accomplished his chores without any problems. It was actually easy for him. He felt stronger. His strength would continue to grow over the coming months. And he says that he felt like there was something there helping him. He said that he didn't feel alone and that there was a sense of comfort. It turns out during this part of his childhood, Maurice was just at his wit's end. He really didn't know what else to do. And so he began to pray to the God and to the devil for help, a way out of his situation. And I guess he kind of saw it as whoever answered first, you know, was fine with him as long as he found an end to this hell that he felt that he was in. You know, there were other things that happened at that time, but we'll go ahead and fast forward that. I don't want to go through all of his traumas because they're not good, you guys. So we're going to go into his first marriage. He had a series of 3 different marriages. He married his childhood sweetheart, Christine, and things weren't too bad then. There were some odd knocks inside the home, some bangings. Things would move around on their own. You would find things in weird places like car keys in the freezer or something. And the weirdest thing that happened during this point was that whenever they would argue, a crucifix that hung on the wall would begin to bleed. It wasn't just a little bit of blood. It would overflow from this cross and just run down the wall and pull at the baseboards. This happened twice. When an argument was particularly bad, it would bleed and then launch itself from the wall and clatter to the floor. It broke, as a matter of fact. The next thing that happened was he married his second wife, Erica. They were married for 9 years. He never told her about the odd happenings, you know, before when he was married to Christine, but he didn't have to because she would see them for herself. Heavy objects would begin to levitate and float slowly across the room. Things would smash against walls. There were sounds of things breaking, and when you would run to see what it was, nothing was broken. Everything was fine. They had gotten a dog, a beagle named Peter, and Maurice loved this beagle. It was his buddy. It died one day, and Erica asked Maurice what had happened to Peter, and Maurice told her that he had been hit by a car. When Erica went down to the accident spot where it happened, she didn't see any tire tracks or anything, but she did see a bloody pickaxe. And she said that as much as she knew Maurice loved Peter, he cried when he buried him and things like that. She also knew that he killed Peter. It was during this time that the police paid Maurice a visit to tell him that he needed to call his sister. There had been an accident. When he called his sister, trigger warning, this is not a very pretty incident at all. And it involves death in a very bad way. So if you are sensitive to those kinds of things, then you might want to fast forward about a minute and a half. When he called his sister, he learned that his father, Philippe, and his mother, Alice, were killed in their home in Oklahoma via a murder-suicide. It turns out that the police believe that Philippe killed his wife Alice and then unalived himself. That night, Maurice went to sleep and he had a very vivid dream where he was seeing things from his mother's point of view. She was in the bed and he could see his father, Philippe, pacing back and forth across the room, raving like a madman. He had a firearm in his hands, and he began to mercilessly beat Alice. She begged him to stop and asked him why. Why was he doing this? And in a very calm, steady voice, Philippe says, "Why not? Have we not used this worm to torture you and your family for years? Tortured him too, truth be told, and it can be now that his time is over. Were we not invited in? Did your own son not evoke our name? Oh, we are the devil, and we're going to kill you. And then this worm. Then we're going to pay old Maurice a visit." Alice began reciting the Lord's Prayer, and unfortunately, she was dead before she could finish. Maurice woke with a start, trying to forget this nightmare, chalking it up as a dream, but he knew that it wasn't. He knew that he had just witnessed the last moments of his mother's life, and a side of his father that he had never seen before. After a couple of other incidents, eventually Erica left as well, and in 1984 Maurice moved to New York and found work on a farm there. He was happy for a time. He met his third wife, Nancy, who was a devout woman. She was religious. She was a no-nonsense kind of lady who everybody said was extremely generous and friendly, but she was just very blunt. You know, she was a very practical person. They were thinking about buying their own farm in Massachusetts, and when Nancy said that they should pray about it, Maurice flew into a rage. He grabbed the crucifix from around her neck and threw it into the woods, and then he kicked her off the front porch. She was shaken. She forgave him, and when she tried to talk to him about it later that afternoon, he had no memory of the event. That seemed to happen a lot with Maurice. The next day, he actually returned her crucifix, saying that in the middle of the night, a woman in white came to him and led him to it. And he took it and gave it back to Nancy. In 1985, a year after they were married, spontaneous fires began to happen around Maurice. The first one burned their backyard shed to the ground. The second burned their vegetable stand. They were tomato farmers, and that was their way to make a living. They sold their vegetables to the community, to the people in town. Their stand burned down. And the third fire began in Nancy's daughter Jenny's room. There were no sources for these fires. They were unexplained. Another night, Nancy awoke to find Maurice looming over her with this unbelievably wide grin, and he was muttering something in a gravelly voice under his breath that she couldn't understand. He just kind of stood there staring at her like this for a while, and she was trying to wake him up, but she couldn't. Finally, he came to and had no idea what he was doing. This would kind of start happening on a regular basis, and it always gave her a sense of dread and a sense of doom when this kind of thing would happen. Another thing that started happening during this time was he began to bleed from his eyes. They would turn black like a shark's eyes, and blood would pool in them and then drip down his face. She would notice when he would be getting ready for bed at night and he would take his shirt off that there were crosses, upside down crosses, burned into his back or gouged into his back or his legs and things, but they were in places that Maurice wouldn't be able to do this to himself. She also would catch him doing things, like one time she saw him lift their tractor with one hand. A lot of people talked about how unnaturally strong Maurice was. It was one reason he had a lot of friends around town, because when they needed something done that was really hard, they called Maurice because he'd be able to do it easily, you know. And so that was kind of odd. He also began to appear in 2 places at once. One time, it got so bad that she started following him from room to room to try to catch these things happen. Her and her daughter Jenny were sitting on the couch one day watching TV. And she saw Maurice. It was -3 degrees outside, but she sees Maurice come through the living room. He's wearing jeans and an undershirt, and he walks out the front door. She yells at him to put a coat on, but you know, he's not hearing it. So Jenny wants to go with him, and she runs back to her room to grab her coat. Nancy all of a sudden hears her scream and goes to find out what the deal is, and they both see Maurice sitting on the side of the bed putting his boots on. So who the hell was that just walked out the front door in an undershirt and jeans? You know, I mean, it was just things like that happened a lot, this whole doppelganger thing. That'll come into play a little bit later. Let's see. Oh, he did. At this time, he did check into a hospital. There was an incident where Nancy had called the police because she was afraid for her life. The officers came out. They saw Maurice sitting at the table. He was in another trance, but he had blood all over his face and stuff. And they had asked Nancy what happened. She said that he had gone into the bathroom earlier that morning. He didn't come out for a long time, and she started hearing really weird, bizarre noises coming from the bathroom. So she opens the door. Okay, now picture this, y'all. She opens the door to find Maurice lying on his back in a fetal position and gyrating like a toy top, right? Blood was coming from his eyes and his nose and his ears, and he had this bloody froth at his mouth. The bathroom was covered in blood. The officers saw that. It was on the tub, all over the floor, on the sink. It was after that event, you know, the officers didn't do anything. They left. That when Nancy tried to explain to him what was going on and told him to call Father Beardsley, their local parish priest, they did, and Beardsley assured them there were some weird things happening, and so they just left. They couldn't find really any sign of domestic violence, so what could they do? But it was after that incident that Maurice checked into a hospital. He was there for a while. They witnessed him bleeding from the eyes. They heard him speak fluent Latin backwards. He would go into these convulsions. He was restrained to the bed. The fact that Maurice would even speak Latin at all is odd, because Maurice was 13 in the 3rd grade, and that's when he dropped out, in the 3rd grade. He had a third-grade education, and even though he could speak French fluently, Latin was beyond him. He couldn't even speak English fluently. It was his second language. He could understand it, but he had an issue with speaking it. He could speak some, but not a whole lot. He was more comfortable speaking French. When they released him from the hospital, they couldn't find any issues, psychological or medical, to explain the spontaneous wounds that would pop up, or the frothy blood coming from his mouth, or him bleeding from his eyes. They couldn't find anything wrong with it, you know. When Nancy called their parish priest, Father Beardsley, he couldn't get an exorcism officiated through the church, and he was kind of at his wit's end with things also, so he put Nancy in touch with Ed and Lorraine Warren. And when Ed and Lorraine came out to the house, Maurice and Nancy were interviewed. Maurice kind of told them that he believed that day when he was 14 and he spoke out against his father, that the devil heard him. And he had thought that this other that had been with him for his whole life had been a friend. What he thought was his guardian angel, he didn't think that that was the case anymore. He thought that he had unwittingly invited something evil into his life at that time, and it had just been with him ever since. Ed and Lorraine told Father Beardsley that he was possessed, diabolically possessed, and that an exorcism was indeed needed. They caught some evidence and they shared it with Beardsley, who took it to his bishop, Harrington. Harrington said that they wouldn't go forward with anything until Maurice was seen by their church psychologist, which he was. And the psychologist said that they didn't believe a word Maurice said as far as the possession or the other evil events that were happening around him, and therefore they would not sanction an exorcism. One of the most frightening things happened one day when Nancy went looking for Maurice and found him in the greenhouse. He was just staring out of the glass, out of the window, and when she called his name, he turned towards her with this look of loathing and malice just on his face. She'd never seen that look come from him when he looked at her before. And his eyes were slits, and he doubled over in pain for a minute, and when he straightened up again, his face had morphed into something that was just alien, inhuman. His skin was that of a corpse. She said that it had looked like the flesh was peeling from his face. His nose had broadened and flattened. And he had an impossibly wide grin on his face at the time. He turned towards her, and she said that this odor filled the air, and it was just rot. It was decaying flesh and excrement, and just unbelievably awful. She felt like he was about to hurt her, and she reached for the crucifix around her neck, and she commanded this thing to leave them in the name of Jesus. And when she did that, he opened his mouth impossibly wide, and instead of it being circular, it was a square. And he emitted this high-pitched, shrieking wail and just vomited tons of blood and this yellow glue-like fluid all over the place, all over the floor of the greenhouse and everywhere. She called Bishop Harrington herself, and he decided to send Catholic healers to the house. This had no effect. Maurice actually went into convulsions and vomited the bloody foam and the yellow glue-like substance in front of the healers, and they left. There was nothing that they could do. Excuse me. The final straw came when her and Maurice were alone together in their bedroom, and they were saying the Hail Marys together. She was kneeling beside the bed, and she says that she felt hands encircle her throat and began to squeeze. It began to strangle her. She couldn't breathe. It was cutting off her air. She looked to her husband for help, and he was perched on their bed on the balls of his feet, staring at her. He was perched like a gargoyle, staring at her with that impossibly wide grin and this sadistic gleam to his eyes that were solid black yet again. And he began to laugh. His mouth didn't move, but this gravelly, guttural laugh just came from him. And he didn't help her. He laughed until she passed out. When she came to, Maurice had no idea what she was talking about. Yet again, we have the lapse in memory. And she knew then that if something wasn't done quick, fast, and in a hurry, that they were both going to end up dead. She called Ed and Lorraine Warren, who decided that she was right, and they called Bishop Harrington, who had by this time officially said that they were not going to do an exorcism. Period. The end. They weren't getting it. So they decided to take matters in their own hands and informed them that they would be bringing out the big guns. In which case they did. They actually wrote a book about this whole incident. It's called Satan's Harvest, and as normal, I'll have that listed in the description box down below. It's a pretty good read. It's a pretty good read. I mean, if you've ever read anything by the Warrens, you kind of understand how they're written. But I liked it. You know, it's good for what it is. The Warrens spent a lot of time with the family, and Nancy actually credits them for the happy times that she got to spend with Maurice, you know. So, the Warrens decided to call in the big guns in the form of Bishop Robert McKenna. If you see Bishop McKenna, he is this tiny little man. As a matter of fact, in the footage of one of the exorcisms that I'm going to insert here, or maybe at the end of the video, you'll be able to see just how slight he is, but he is very well respected. Now, I had to ask myself, how could a bishop from the Catholic Church perform the exorcism if the church refused to sanction an official exorcism? And come to find out that Bishop McKenna is what's known as a seti probationist. Now, when the church decided to modernize a little bit back in the mid-1960s, there was a branch of the more conservative clergy members that kind of broke off. They didn't agree with the changes, and Bishop McKenna was part of this branch. They do see the Pope as being the head of the church, but they also believe that until the Pope changes things back to the old ways, that he really doesn't have a whole lot of power to do the things that he does. That's in their belief. Now, these members are not defrocked or excommunicated, so that's how Bishop McKenna could get away with performing these rogue exorcisms, and he did several, a lot of them. I mean, he worked closely with the Warrens in a lot of different cases. So, the exorcism was set to begin on May 2nd, 1985. Hey y'all, Editing Brandie here. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and insert the exorcism clip from the Maurice Theriault exorcism. It's about 5 minutes long. I find it extremely interesting. The quality is not that great, but that's because it's kind of hard to find online. I will link it in the video that I got down below. All credit for this one goes to Haley Reese. I absolutely love her, and this was a great source to find. So, anywho, I hope that you guys enjoy it. So, let's get on with the clip.
This is the exorcism part right here. You'll see the spittle come out of his mouth.
did have a series of 2. Everyone involved met at the Theriaults' home. The air was extremely heavy with tension, anticipation, fear, and dare I say, tinged with a slight hint of evil. Maurice was sitting in the living room in the middle, or in a chair in the middle of the living room, and there were people all around him. The bishop began the exorcism by anointing Maurice's forehead with holy water in the shape of a cross. And then they were off to the races. The bishop was praying, and a loud banging began to be heard coming from Maurice's bedroom, but the bedroom was empty prior to the exorcism starting, and I don't think anybody there was brave enough to go check, so they didn't. There was a cacophony of whispering voices that would just echo. It was like thousands of them. And you can't hear it on camera, but everyone that was there says they heard it. It was just like, it was horrible. It was louder and louder and louder, and objects began to levitate and began to move. And this was in, the bishop, he didn't stop praying. He wasn't scared. He prayed without ceasing. It didn't matter what parlor tricks the devil had up his sleeve. Bishop McKenna, this wasn't his first rodeo. The witnesses there, and this you'll see on the video footage, said that Maurice's skin began to bubble and blister. He began to kind of drool, and it was clear until it hit the white of his t-shirt where it turned to blood. He began to foam at the mouth. His eyes became slits. His irises became slits in his head, and then they were just surrounded by the white. One side of his face begins to bubble, and a gash opens up in his forehead, and it begins to bleed. All of this happens. The bishop asked the entity inside of Maurice to reveal himself, and the entity, in this gravelly, creepy voice, just tells the bishop, "I am what I am. I am the only one." And then Maurice just kind of goes out. He loses consciousness. They tend to him. That's where the footage kind of ends. The people around him tend to him, and they're wiping his brow and everything. Maurice kind of wakes up, and he feels fabulous, yet again. He says that he's free. He starts exclaiming and crying tears of joy. The air is no longer heavy. It's lifted. There's kind of a light floral scent to the air. Maurice is he's happy. Everyone there feels the change. And the bishop finalizes the exorcism. Everybody leaves grateful and thankful to God that Maurice was able to be delivered from this unholy, lifelong, it's been like 40 or 50 years at this point that this guy's been living with this torment, and it's finally gone. It's finally gone, and he can live a happy life with himself and his wife and their kids, So, the Theriaults lived happily for a few years, and when the farm eventually failed, and it did, they moved into town, into a nice, detached home in the middle of the suburbs. But the fairy tale was short-lived. You remember I told you guys there's no happy ending to this story. It was that year that Jenny had revealed to her father that something horrific had been going on. That this thing that looked like Maurice, but wasn't the real Maurice, had been R-wording her for years by that point. Her father obviously reported this to the police because, hello, and Maurice was arrested. He was charged for this crime, but he swore vehemently that he did not do this. It was not him. when Chief Siebert, who had kind of been, he was the officer that was called to the bathroom scene, and he knew, he had dealt with Maurice for years also, when they would get called out to calm him down or when Maurice was acting up. So Chief Siebert was familiar with him. When he was filling out the paperwork on this, Maurice went into the trance again and looked at him with those black eyes and told him, "We're going to be together for a long time, you and I," in this awful voice. Chief Siebert had a bottle of old holy water that he kept in his desk that he'd take with him when he had to make the house calls out to Maurice, and he doused Maurice with it, who came out of his trance and was okay. But the DA, who was kind of iffy about pressing charges on Maurice anyway because of a total overall lack of evidence to back up what Jenny had claimed, decided to drop the charges after, what the Warrens say, after he received the detailed copy of the exorcism that Maurice underwent. I don't know. I kind of think it was more about Jenny refusing to testify against the real Maurice that led to the DA dismissing the charges. But what do I know? Maybe it was the fact that he had this exorcism, so he was good now. I don't know. But the fact that Jenny wouldn't press charges against Maurice herself because she was absolutely sure that this thing that had been doing these awful things to her was not the real Maurice, but this doppelganger. I don't know, you guys. I don't know. I don't know what to think about that. Despite those accusations, Nancy and Maurice lived together for the next 7 years, and one day, out of the blue, Nancy called the Warrens to tell them that Maurice had been up to his old tricks again. We don't really know what those tricks were. But whatever it was really bad, because before the Warrens could make a game plan or come up with what to do, Nancy had actually gotten a restraining order against him, and she moved out of the house and she had filed for divorce. So, I mean, those things were going really quick. Trigger warning. This is kind of a rough incident. It involves firearms, trauma, and death. In 1992, Maurice broke into Nancy's home and held her hostage for several hours at gunpoint. She said that it seemed like he was a man at war with himself, and there was a point towards the end there that he actually had the firearm to Nancy's head. And she said it looked like he was playing tug of war against an unknown opponent. And at the last second, he tugged the firearm and she was hit in her arm and her torso, not in her head. He then turned the firearm on himself, stuck it in his mouth, and completed the attempt that he had made years ago at unaliving himself. He succeeded in that goal that day. So Nancy says when the smoke finally cleared and the echo from these shots finally died down, before she ran to the neighbors for help, the only thing that she could say was the word amen. That seems kind of fitting, I think, maybe, to the close of a horrible story. She ran to the neighbor's house. They took her to the hospital, and Nancy ended up making a full recovery. But it was pretty bad, you guys. It was rough. And that concludes the story of Maurice Frenchy Theriault, who lived I don't know, the majority of his life just sounds awful. There were some bright spots here and there. But that brings me to a question. I was sitting here and I was thinking about it. And, you know, there was another Warrens case, the latest Conjuring movie, the Devil Made Me Do It case. And that's where they tried to put the defense of being possessed on trial with Arnie Cheyenne Johnson. And we're not going to get into that case, but he killed his landlord and said that he was under possession at the time. They argued the case in court and Arnie lost, and so he spent several years in prison because of that. But this makes me think of that case, and I wonder if you believe in that sort of thing, if you are a believer in possession and you believe that that kind of thing is real, do you think that that could possibly happen, that people could commit horrible crimes under the influence of something else inside of them? Or do you think that it's just a load of crap and that evil is just something that men do? That we have that tendency, not men, people, that people do. That we all have that inside of us somewhere. And some people just can't help it, you know, and it comes out and they commit these horrible atrocities. I don't know. I'm not saying that it's any kind of excuse by any means for any bad behavior, but it does make one think about that. So, I don't know. I want to hear what you think in the comment box down below. I will list all of my resources in the description box that I found along with the Warrens book. Also, the footage that I found that you saw, I will post a link to where I got it from. I got it from a Haley Reese video. Thank you so much, Haley. I really enjoyed that. Because you can't really find other things on there about the exorcism that are such good quality. Now, I will say the exorcism was done on VHS tape. And you'll hear Tony Spera, who is the Warrens' son-in-law, talk about the case a little bit. So you'll get a little bit of backstory there to him, to the exorcism itself. So I'll link that in the comment box down below. And as always, I appreciate you guys for joining me. And I know that this was a long one. I hope that you come back. I hope you enjoyed the changes that were made to this video. And I will see you guys next week with a lighter case, but a good one. So I will talk to y'all later. Bye, guys.